Whenever you have a system that is reliant upon composition, it's critical that each piece of that system has an interface for accepting data from outside of itself. Without the ability to pass data, in this case username, to each of our functions, our composition would break down. Similarly, because React relies heavily on composition, there needs to exist a way to pass data into components. This brings us to props. Props are to components what arguments are to functions. In fact, the same intuition you have about arguments and functions can be directly applied to components and props. Naturally, there are two parts to understanding how props work: how to pass data into components and accessing the data once it's been passed in. Passing data into components should feel pretty natural because you've been doing something similar ever since you learned HTML. You pass data to a React component the same way you'd set an attribute on an HTML element. Here, we're passing in a name prop to the hello component. It's important to note that we're not limited to passing just strings as props. Just like we can pass functions or any other value as arguments, so too can we pass any value as props. One thing you may have noticed is that sometimes we have to wrap what we're passing in inside of curly braces. Can you spot why that is? The rule is that anytime you're passing a prop that isn't a string, you must wrap it inside of a curly brace. The reason for that is curly brace allows you to use JavaScript inside of your markup. Following that rule, though this looks a little weird, you can even pass object literals to components as props. Notice we're using two sets of curly braces. If you think about it, that makes sense. We have an object which we want to pass as a prop, and since it's not a string, we wrap it in another set of curly braces, getting us two pairs. Now before we look at how to access props, there's one more thing to be aware of with passing them. If you pass a prop without a value, that value will be set to true, meaning these are equivalent. So now the big question: how do you access props from inside the component? Well, since components are just functions, it's pretty simple. React will put all of the props on an object and pass that object as the first argument to the function when it renders. Regardless of how many props you pass to a component, each prop is added as a key on the props object. And because props is just an object, you can also destructure it if you'd like. Now take a look at this anchor element. Is there any data we're passing it that's not as an attribute? What about the home text? As part of the API for almost every HTML element, you can pass data via the opening and closing tag of that element. Now, what if instead of those being regular HTML elements, they were React components? Instead of passing data into components via setting attributes as we usually would, we're passing data into the component via the opening and closing tags of the element. In this scenario, how would we then access the data from inside the component? React, again, makes this pretty simple. Whatever is between the opening and closing tag of an element will be accessible inside of the component as a children property on the props object. You can think of a component with a children prop as having a placeholder that can be filled by its parent component. Because of this, it's common to utilize children to create layout type components that encapsulate styling and logic, but leave the content to the consumer of the component. A common example of this is a modal component. Notice that we encapsulate the styling and logic of the modal into the modal component, but we can specify what the contents of modal are when we create the modal element.
An absolutely seamless use of props